Please be seated. This morning we hear the story of Hannah, and I'm sorry Hannah is not here. Hannah had a complicated life. Hannah was married to Elkanah. Elkanah also had another wife whose name was Peninnah. Back then, they lived in Judah, and to bear a son was the greatest blessing to the family. Well, Elkanah's, Peninnah, wife, had lots of sons, lots of beautiful daughters. But Hannah could not get pregnant. And yet Hannah was Elkanah's favorite. So that Peninnah was always angry at Hannah and would brag and boast and sort of wave her children under Hannah's nose. She only had one nose. But meanwhile, Elkanah is saying, Hannah's my favorite wife. Every year, the family would go to a holy place called Shiloh to offer sacrifices. Hannah loved these trips because Shiloh was a sacred place for her. Shiloh was the place where she could go and really feel that God was present with her, that God was listening, that God heard her. It was her sacred place. It was where she could leave all of that behind and be with God. So the family goes to Shiloh, and Elkanah does his sacrifices, and afterwards they have a large feast. Well, by that time, Hannah had it. Hannah wanted to get away from watching Peninnah's children. Hannah just wanted to go into the quiet of the temple, so she snuck away from the feast. She walked quietly by Eli, the old priest, who was at the door of the temple, and fell on her knees in prayer. It was the kind of prayer that is so deep in sorrow that nothing really comes out of your heart and out of your mouth. You are just racked with that anguish. Because Hannah did not bring sacrifices of any kind. She brought her prayer of loneliness, anguish. And out of her grief, she spoke to God in that sacred place. Because she knew it was where God listened. Well, Eli, being an old priest who completely missed the whole what was going on, as some old priests do, came up to Hannah and thought Hannah was in such turmoil that she was actually drunk. And so he starts to reprimand Hannah. Well, Hannah was in such a sacred place and so one with God that she turned to Eli and started to speak back to him and say, "Excuse me, I am not drunk. I am speaking to God. And God and I are having a very important conversation here. So, thank you very much." Fortunately, Eli, like all good priests, understood and realized that God was present in the mystery of what was happening in the temple. And that Eli backed off and said, "May God bless you in whatever it is that you want." Something happened in the mystery of that temple that night. Because when Hannah walked home back to Judah, she was at peace. Something happened in that sacred place that gave her the assurance that God had listened to her. It wasn't perhaps an assurance that she would get pregnant and bear a son, But she knew that somehow God had heard her in her sacred place, in that holiness. Well, it did occur that Hannah got pregnant and bore a son named Samuel. And year after year, they brought Samuel back to Shiloh, back to the temple, and said, "Here is, dear God, what you have promised me. Here is my son." Well, she eventually forgave Eli because she offered Samuel to the temple. And one time while they were at the temple, Hannah and Elkanah left Samuel in the care of Eli. Shiloh continued to be a holy place for Hannah. That temple continued to be where she would go as the sacredness would be. Thank heavens Hannah was not there when they tore down that temple. Thank heavens that Hannah never had to see the temple destroyed and her sacred place being left as a wasteland, as it was some years later after Hannah and Elkanah visited. It was destroyed. There was a philosopher theologian in the 20th century named Mircea Eliade, who was a Dutch philosopher, who studied the importance of a sacred place in humans' lives. Whether it be a building, a trinket, a person, we all seek a sacredness, a place where we know God is present, where there is some kind of mysterious holiness that is held by this sacredness, whether it is a cross we wear around our neck, or whether it is a building, like it was for Hannah at Shiloh. It is the sacred place where we go. It is the place where we come and know that there is some kind of mysteriousness, holiness, presence of God, where the outside world seems to disappear and God is present here, now. Because where else in the world can you go but a place like St. Margaret's and fall on your knees and say, "I don't quite understand, God, what is happening here." And you being assured that God is present and listening. It's not exactly the conversation you have around the water cooler or around in your cubicle. It's not the kind of conversation you have in the outside world where you don't quite understand. And yet here you can bring your questions. Here you can bring and try to understand the mystery of the holiness and the sacredness of where we are here and now. For this is a holy place. And what a shame it would be if it wasn't here. What a shame it would be if for some reason there were no bricks and mortar here. That this place had been destroyed and left a wasteland. That our Shiloh was no more. There have been three sort of examples of how we hold St. Margaret's as a holy place and why it is important to have this building. A couple of weeks ago, we had a wedding here. It was the wedding of a beautiful girl who had grown up in this parish. She had gone off and gone to college and met the man of her dreams, and yet she wanted to come back here for her wedding. This was her holy place. This is her sacred place. And so as we stood and had that beautiful wedding, there were her family and her friends, and Michael's family and his friends. And this was a sacred place. And then you could see the people people who were here who had seen her grown, who had helped her grow up. It was a sacred place and a sacred moment. And how sad it would have been if St. Margaret's hadn't been here to hold this place, to hold that sacred mystery of whatever happened in that wedding, in that marriage, in that girl's life, that she could come back here and hold the mystery and the sacrament of marriage. The second was perhaps on the opposite side. It was the death of Anna Hague. Anna had lived in a retirement home for a long time. Most of her family had died. Most of her friends had died. Anna was deaf, was blind, and yet the only people who came to visit her were the Eucharistic visitors, along with her goddaughter, Doris, and her family. So when Anna died, we had the burial out in the graveyard. And as we buried her ashes, there were about 20, 25 people there. And most of the people there were the Eucharistic visitors from St. Margaret's. Mike Wynn's happy band of people who bring out the communion from this altar to the shut-ins. They had become Anna's family. And so when I invited everyone to introduce themselves and tell a story about Anna, it was the Eucharistic visitors who brought us to tears, who brought us to laughter, who knew the stories of Anna. We had become her sacred community. We had become the ones who remembered her, who knew her. How sad it would have been if her sacred community had not been there for her, had not remembered her, had not brought her communion and laughed with her. When I went to visit her, she had absolutely no idea who I was. In fact, she thought I was Doris's sister. And she was very impressed that Doris's sister had become a priest. But we were still holding the sacredness for her. We were the ones who remembered her. How sad it would have been if we had not been there as she was buried. The third occurrence was the partnership between All Saints and All Souls a couple of weeks ago. Some of you brought your neighbors for the All Saints service, and we were rocking. I can tell you, it was a wonderful service. One of you brought your neighbor who was a young woman and her child. She had never been here before. And she was clapping and laughing and singing along with us. But what she heard was the All Saints, about the All Souls service, about the service the next day where we were going to hold in honor those that had died. We would honor those who were grieving. So she came with her young son because she had had a terrible year. She had lost her mother, lost her father, lost her best friends. And yet she felt that this was the holy place, this was the sacred place where she could be honored in that grief. And so she came up and lit the candles. And she brought her the names of those who had died and their mementos. And it was here that she felt, very much like Hannah, kind of the idea that God had listened to her in her grief. It was here that she had come to honor those who had died, but also to honor what she was feeling inside. It was here she felt the comfort. It was here that she felt that God was present. How sad it would have been if St. Margaret's hadn't been here for both times in her life, for both the rocking service on All Saints and the quiet meditation and honoring of grief the next day. There are many times in our lives when we are enveloped with an confusion and an ununderstanding of the mystery of this world. And yet it's here that we can come. Most of us have been reading about what has happened in Paris. And we understand, or at least I do, that that is evil incarnate. When people are killed randomly out of hate and out of anger. I feel so helpless. Some of you will be called to do whatever we can do against ISIS or against whomever did this. But all I can do is pray. Come here like Hannah and simply pray for those who died, against the evil that has occurred in this world, wherever it's Paris or wherever. This is the sacred place where we come to offer up those prayers. Like Hannah, we can pray out of our deep grief, out of those, and using words that don't come out of our mouths, but come out of our hearts. It is our sacred place. It is where we hold the mystery. It is where God is, where we can count on. That this building will be here, the bricks will be here, our community of sacred holding and believing people will be here. It is here at St. Margaret's that we hold sacred. Thank heavens it is here. Amen.